It all started on a warm afternoon at the bustling city airport. Travelers moved through the terminal like a stream of busy ants, each with their own destination, their own story. Some walked briskly, dragging suitcases behind them, others sat in scattered rows of chairs, scrolling through their phones or chatting in low voices. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the nearby cafe mingled with the faint whirring of suitcase wheels on the polished floor. The atmosphere was alive with energy, some of it rushed, some excited, some impatient. Among the crowd was Lila Carter, a composed and graceful black woman in her early 40s. Dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored black slacks, her outfit was professional yet understated. Her braided hair was tied neatly into a low bun, and she carried a single black leather tote over her shoulder. She walked with a quiet confidence that turned a few heads, though not for the reasons she might have liked. As Lila approached the airline service desk for first-class upgrades, a murmur began to ripple through the nearby travelers. She hadn't said a word yet, hadn't even made her request, but her presence alone seemed to invite unsolicited opinions. "Is she serious?" whispered a man in a sharp gray suit, standing just a few feet behind her. His tone carried an unmistakable blend of disbelief and condescension. A woman standing nearby, balancing a designer handbag on her arm, stifled a laugh. "She must be confused," she said softly, though her voice was loud enough to ensure others heard. Her eyes darted toward Lila, then quickly away, as though she expected her to overhear but didn't care if she did. Lila, however, didn't flinch. She'd heard the whispers, sensed the stares. It wasn't the first time she'd been judged prematurely, and she doubted it would be the last. She straightened her shoulders and stepped forward to the counter, her face calm and unreadable. The airline attendant behind the desk, a young woman with a practiced smile, greeted her with polite indifference. Her eyes flicked over Lila's attire, then shifted to the screen in front of her. "Good afternoon," the attendant said. "How can I help you today?" Lila returned the smile, though hers was warmer and far more genuine. "Good afternoon. I'd like to inquire about an upgrade to first class for my flight," she said, her tone measured and respectful. For a brief moment, the attendant seemed caught off guard, as if the request had come from someone she didn't expect to ask. She quickly regained her composure and typed something into the computer. But there was a flicker of hesitation in her response, a slight pause before she replied. "First-class upgrades are limited," the attendant said, her tone polite but tinged with doubt. She didn't outright deny the possibility, but the subtle emphasis on limited carried a different message altogether. Behind Lila, the murmurs grew louder. The man in the gray suit smirked and shook his head. "What a waste of time," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. The woman with the handbag chuckled again, this time more openly. Lila heard every word. She felt the judgment in the air, heavy and suffocating, like an unwelcome cloud hovering over her. But she didn't let it show. Her expression remained steady, her eyes focused on the attendant in front of her. "Of course," Lila replied, nodding slightly. "I understand it may not be available. But I'd appreciate it if you could check for me." The attendant hesitated again, then began typing on her keyboard, her movements slower than before. It was as though she were deliberately dragging out the process, as if to subtly underscore her own doubts about the request. Meanwhile, the whispers around Lila continued to grow. A young couple seated nearby exchanged amused glances. An older man standing in line behind her sighed audibly, clearly impatient with what he saw as an unnecessary delay. Lila stood there quietly, her hands resting lightly on the counter. She didn't turn to acknowledge the voices or the stares. She didn't need to. Their words might have been intended to wound, but to her, they were little more than background noise. As the attendant continued her search, Lila allowed herself a moment to glance around the terminal. She saw businessmen in tailored suits tapping away on their laptops, families herding excited children toward boarding gates, and solo travelers lost in their own thoughts. It was a world in constant motion, each person absorbed in their own little bubble of importance. And yet, in this sea of people, all it took was one request, one bold step forward to attract such disproportionate attention. Finally, the attendant looked up, her expression apologetic but still faintly dismissive. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, shaking her head. "There are no upgrades available at this time." The words were delivered with a finality that left no room for argument. But Lila didn't argue. She simply nodded, thanked the woman politely, and stepped aside to allow the next person in line to approach the counter. As she moved to the side, she caught the smirk on the face of the man in the gray suit. "Called it," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those around him to hear. The woman with the handbag didn't even try to hide her amusement. "Some people just don't know their place," she said, shaking her head with a smug smile. Lila paused for a moment, her back to the crowd. Her fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her tote bag, but her face remained calm. She glanced at her watch, noting the time. Little did they know, the next 10 minutes would change everything. Lila didn't let the comments or dismissive attitudes get to her. Years of experience had taught her one valuable lesson: people often judge what they don't understand. And when they underestimate you, that's the perfect opportunity to show them your strength. She walked away from the counter, her head held high. The soft murmur of laughter and whispered comments followed her, but she tuned them out like background noise. As she made her way to a nearby seating area, she pulled her phone out of her bag, her expression calm but purposeful. Taking a seat by the large airport windows, she gazed at the planes outside for a moment before dialing a number. The phone rang once, twice, before a deep voice answered on the other end. "Ms. Carter," the voice said, immediately switching to a respectful tone. "How can I assist you today?" Lila smiled faintly. "It's time," she said simply. There was no need for lengthy explanations, the person on the other end clearly knew what she meant. "Yes, ma'am," the voice replied. "I'll make the necessary calls immediately." She hung up without another word, tucking her phone back into her bag. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to take in the scene around her. The airport was still buzzing with activity, the same mixture of chaos and order that seemed to define places like this. And yet, Lila felt a shift in the air, a quiet, almost imperceptible change. She glanced over her shoulder toward the counter where she had just been. The man in the gray suit had stepped forward to speak with the attendant, his demeanor confident, almost arrogant. Lila watched as he handed over his boarding pass, likely asking for the same first-class upgrade she had inquired about. The attendant smiled at him, a genuine smile, not the forced politeness she had shown Lila earlier. She began typing on her computer, and within moments, the man was handed a new ticket. His smirk widened as he turned away from the counter, his eyes briefly meeting Lila's as he walked past. "Better luck next time," he said with a mocking chuckle, clearly enjoying the perceived superiority of his situation. Lila didn't respond. She simply watched him walk away, her expression unreadable. But inside, she felt a surge of resolve. People like him, the ones who looked down on others, who assumed they were better simply because of their status or appearance, they were the reason she worked as hard as she did. Moments later, the woman with the designer handbag approached the counter. She, too, received her upgrade without hesitation. The attendant handed her the ticket with the same warm smile she had given the man, and the woman strutted away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Lila sighed softly, leaning back in her seat. It wasn't the denial of the upgrade that bothered her, it was the principle of it all. The blatant inequality, the unspoken biases that dictated how people were treated. It was something she had faced her entire life, in one form or another. But today, things would be different. Today, she wasn't just another passenger. She checked her watch again, noting the time. A few more minutes, she thought. Just a few more minutes. underscore 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 on. Across the terminal, a small group of airline employees gathered near the boarding gate for Lila's flight. They were dressed in crisp uniforms, their expressions professional but slightly tense. Among them was a man in his late 40s, his name tag identifying him as the regional manager. He held a clipboard in one hand, his phone in the other, and he seemed to be in the middle of a serious conversation. "Yes, I understand," he said into the phone, nodding along as he listened. "We'll handle it right away." After ending the call, the manager turned to his team, his expression grave. "We need to address this immediately," he said. "Ms. Carter is already here, and I don't need to remind you how important this is. Gather everyone involved and meet me at the counter." The employees exchanged nervous glances but nodded in agreement. They began moving quickly, their once casual demeanor replaced with a sense of urgency. Back at her seat, Lila remained calm, her gaze fixed on the runway outside. She could see a plane taxiing to its gate, its sleek body gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was a beautiful sight, but her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts drifted back to the countless times she had been underestimated, the moments when people assumed she didn't belong. Whether it was in boardrooms, social settings, or even places like this, the pattern was always the same. But today wasn't about proving herself, not really. She knew her worth, knew what she had accomplished. Today was about something bigger. She glanced over at the counter again, noticing the growing commotion. The regional manager and his team had arrived, their presence immediately drawing attention. Passengers nearby began whispering among themselves, their curiosity piqued. "What's going on?" someone asked. "Looks like something serious," another replied. Lila allowed herself a small smile. The storm she had been preparing for was about to begin. Underscore 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 on. Minutes later, the announcement came over the intercom, "Will Lila Carter please come to gate A7 immediately?" The voice was calm but firm, cutting through the chatter of the terminal like a bell. Heads turned as people began looking around, trying to figure out who this Lila Carter was. Lila stood gracefully, adjusting the strap of her tote bag before making her way toward the gate. As she walked, she could feel the weight of countless eyes on her. The man in the gray suit, now seated in the waiting area, watched her with a puzzled expression. The woman with the handbag frowned slightly, her curiosity clearly piqued. When Lila reached the gate, the regional manager was waiting for her. His demeanor was polite but clearly nervous. "Ms. Carter," he said, offering a slight bow of his head. "Thank you for your patience. Please allow us to escort you to a more private area." Lila raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. She simply nodded, allowing herself to be led toward a small conference room near the gate. The whispers around her grew louder as she walked, the air thick with speculation. Inside the room, a group of senior airline executives awaited her. They stood as she entered, their expressions a mix of respect and apprehension. Lila took a seat at the head of the table, setting her bag down beside her. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, Lila spoke, her voice calm but commanding. "Let's begin," she said simply. The tension in the terminal was thick, almost tangible. As Lila stood at the counter, the airline attendant didn't even bother to make eye contact. The young woman's fingers danced lazily across the keyboard, her forced smile barely masking her disinterest. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the attendant said after a brief, almost cursory glance at the screen. "First-class upgrades are limited." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The pause before limited wasn't subtle, and neither was the faint tone of condescension in her voice. It was as if she was saying, "You're wasting your time." Lila nodded politely, her expression calm. "I understand," she said, her voice even. "Thank you for checking." But before she could step aside, a man standing just behind her in line decided to make his opinion known. His voice was loud, clear, and dripping with mockery. "Who does she think she is?" he muttered, though it was loud enough for half the terminal to hear. Another woman, dressed impeccably in designer clothes and carrying a small lapdog in her arms, laughed softly. "It's adorable, really. Some people just don't know their place." Lila heard every word. She always did. It wasn't just the words, though, it was the way people said them, the smugness, the derision, the assumption that they knew exactly who she was based on nothing more than her appearance. Still, she didn't react. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't let her shoulders tense, didn't even sigh. She simply turned and stepped aside, letting the next person in line move forward. The man who had been whispering stepped up to the counter, flashing a charming smile at the attendant. He handed over his boarding pass with a flourish. "Let me guess," he said with a grin, "first class is limited, too." The attendant's demeanor shifted instantly. Her smile became warm, genuine, almost eager. "Oh, let me check for you, sir," she said, her tone suddenly enthusiastic. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, and within moments, she handed him a new boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice positively beaming. The man turned, holding up his ticket for all to see. His grin widened as he walked past Lila. "Looks like I made the cut," he said with a chuckle. Lila met his gaze for a brief moment, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, but something in her calm composure made the man falter slightly. Still, he shrugged it off and walked toward the waiting area, his confidence unshaken. The woman with the lapdog was next. She stepped up to the counter with the air of someone who expected to get exactly what she wanted. And she did. Within seconds, the attendant handed her a first-class ticket, complete with a cheerful "Have a wonderful flight, ma'am." As the woman walked past Lila, she gave her a pointed look. "Better luck next time," she said with a smirk, her lapdog yipping softly in agreement. Lila remained still, her hands resting lightly on the strap of her tote bag. On the surface, she seemed completely unfazed. But inside, a fire was smoldering. It wasn't the denial of the upgrade that stung, it was the blatant inequality, the unspoken assumption that she didn't belong. Underscore 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 on. As she made her way to a seat near the window, Lila's mind replayed the events of the last few minutes. She wasn't angry, not exactly. Years of enduring judgment and prejudice had taught her to control her emotions, to channel them into something productive. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her emails, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. She found the message she was looking for and opened it, her eyes scanning the text. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she read the subject line, "Executive Review, Upcoming Visit to Regional Offices." Lila Carter wasn't just any passenger. She was the newly appointed regional director of the airline, a detail that none of the staff or passengers here seemed to know. She'd chosen to travel incognito today, dressed casually and without the usual fanfare, to observe how customers were treated. And what she'd seen so far. It was disappointing, to say the least. Underscore 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 on. Meanwhile, the murmurs around the terminal continued to grow. The man in the gray suit was bragging to anyone who would listen about his success at securing an upgrade. The woman with the lapdog was seated nearby, scrolling through her phone with a satisfied expression. "Did you see her face?" the man said, chuckling. "She actually thought she had a shot at first class. I mean, come on." The woman laughed, shaking her head. "It's just sad. Some people really don't know their limits." Their laughter grated on Lila's nerves, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she took a deep breath and turned her attention back to her phone. She tapped out a quick message, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "To internal team. Subject: immediate review required." Message: "I am currently at airport name, observing passenger treatment and operational procedures. There are serious concerns regarding professionalism and bias among staff. I'll address this in person during the scheduled review meeting. Please prepare a detailed report of employee training protocols and recent customer feedback for my arrival. L. Carter." She hit send and leaned back in her seat, her expression calm but resolute. This wasn't just about her experience today, it was about the culture of the company she was now responsible for leading. And if there was one thing she was certain of, it was that change needed to happen. Underscore 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 on. Minutes later, the regional manager arrived at the terminal. He was a tall, stern-looking man with sharp features and an air of authority. He carried a clipboard in one hand and his phone in the other, his expression serious as he surveyed the scene. He approached the counter, speaking quietly with the attendant. Their conversation was brief, but whatever he said clearly had an impact. The attendant's face went pale, her confident demeanor replaced with a look of nervousness. "Where is she?" the manager asked, his voice low but firm. The attendant pointed toward Lila, who was seated by the window, calmly watching the planes outside. The manager squared his shoulders and approached her, his steps purposeful but hesitant. When he reached her, he cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone respectful but uncertain. Lila turned, her expression polite but cool. "Yes." The manager extended his hand. "My name is Richard Ellis. I'm the regional manager for this branch of the airline. I'd like to apologize personally for any inconvenience you've experienced today." Lila studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. "And what inconvenience would that be, Mr. Ellis?" she asked, her tone even. Richard hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. I was informed that there may have been some miscommunication at the service desk," he said carefully. "I assure you, we take these matters very seriously." Lila smiled faintly. "Good to hear," she said. "Because I'll be addressing this during our review meeting next week." The color drained from Richard's face. "Review meeting," he echoed. Lila stood, adjusting the strap of her tote bag. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm Lila Carter, the new regional director. And I think it's time we had a serious conversation about how this airline treats its passengers." The whispers that had been circling the terminal suddenly stopped. All eyes were on Lila now, the realization of her identity sending shockwaves through the crowd. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. The confident air he had when he first approached Lila had vanished, replaced by visible unease. Around them, the terminal seemed to grow quieter as curious onlookers leaned in to catch what was happening. The man in the gray suit, seated a few rows away, furrowed his brow in confusion. The woman with the lapdog, too, looked up from her phone, her smirk faltering as she tried to piece together what she had just overheard. "Ms. Carter," Richard began again, his voice more tentative now. I wasn't aware you were traveling today. If we had known." Lila held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's precisely the problem, Mr. Ellis," she said calmly. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. Every passenger, every single person deserves the same level of courtesy, regardless of their title, appearance, or anything else. Her voice was steady but firm, cutting through the air like a blade. Richard nodded quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Carter," he stammered. "I'll personally ensure that the situation is addressed immediately." Lila tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Good," she said. "Because what I witnessed today isn't just an isolated incident, it's a systemic issue. And as the regional director, I intend to address it from the top down." Richard's posture stiffened at her words, but he managed a tight nod. "Understood," he said. "If there's anything I can do to assist." "There is," Lila interrupted, her tone sharp but measured. "I'd like to speak with the employees involved in this incident. And I want to see the training materials currently being used for customer service. I trust you can arrange that." Richard hesitated for only a moment before nodding again. "Of course, Ms. Carter. I'll handle it personally." Underscore 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 on. As Richard hurried off to fulfill her request, Lila turned her attention back to the waiting area. The man in the gray suit was now staring openly at her, his previous smugness replaced with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. The woman with the lapdog had turned away, pretending to be engrossed in her phone, though her flushed cheeks betrayed her embarrassment. Lila allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She wasn't the type to revel in others' discomfort, but she couldn't deny that it felt good to see their arrogance crumble. A few minutes later, Richard returned, accompanied by the young attendant from the service desk and another employee as supervisor, judging by his name tag. Both looked visibly nervous, their eyes darting between Richard and Lila. "Ms. Carter," Richard began, gesturing toward the two employees. "This is Julia, one of our service desk attendants, and Mark, her direct supervisor. They'll be happy to address any concerns you may have." Lila stood, smoothing her blazer before stepping forward. She extended a hand to Julia, who hesitated for a moment before shaking it. "Julia," Lila said, her tone polite but firm. "Thank you for taking the time to speak with me." Julia nodded quickly, her expression tense. "Of course, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lila turned to Mark, offering him the same polite handshake. "Mark," she said, "I'd like to start by hearing your perspective on the training your team receives for handling customer interactions." Mark blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. Well," he began, scratching the back of his neck, "we have a standard training program that all employees go through. It covers the basics: greeting passengers, processing requests, that sort of thing." "The basics," Lila repeated, her tone thoughtful. "And how does that training address unconscious bias?" Mark froze, his eyes widening slightly. "Unconscious bias," he echoed. "Yes," Lila said, her voice calm but pointed. "The subtle assumptions and judgments people make based on things like race, gender, or socioeconomic status. How does your training prepare employees to recognize and address those biases?" Mark hesitated, glancing nervously at Richard, who was standing nearby with a strained expression. Julia shifted uncomfortably beside him, her gaze fixed on the floor. I don't think we specifically cover that," Mark admitted finally. Lila nodded, as if she had expected the answer. "I see," she said. "And what about escalation procedures? How do you ensure that all customer complaints or concerns are handled fairly and without prejudice?" Mark opened his mouth, but no answer came. Julia glanced up briefly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Lila sighed softly, her expression one of quiet disappointment. "That's what I thought," she said. "Thank you for your honesty, Mark." And Julia, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. Julia looked up, surprised by the sincerity in Lila's tone.